my name is Paul Baker. I live in Manchester in England, and I'm a community organiser, and I've been involved in the Hearing Voices movement really since the beginning, when I first met Marius in Italy in 1986, 87, something like this. My idea with the Hearing Voices Network has always been to create a kind of non-bureaucratic, dynamic organisation where we connect as human beings. This has always been my value.
Can you tell me what is your motivation or the background story? How did you start to get involved in the Hearing Voices movement?
It's kind of weird, really. I mean, I was a mental health activist and campaigner in my early 20s, really because at the time we were trying to close the total institution which was present in my country. So the idea was more to emancipate patients. But the more we understood about mental health, the more critical we became, not only of the institution, the buildings, and what was going on in the buildings, but also what they were doing with people, what they understood to be the problem. So I had already this energy. And then I had a very deeply personal experience where my brother, Alan, began to have in quotation marks, a psychosis episode, or he began to hear voices. He began to interpret the world through sensations. And for him, this was a spiritual crisis. And I feel, even though I managed to get him out of the hospital in terms of human rights and using the legal process, I did not understand or connect with this experience. It was too difficult for me, too mysterious, and I think I failed him. And when I met Marius, this was already in my mind about voices and things. So when I had this conversation with Marius reframed it, thought about it in terms of an experience, not an illness. It kind of clicked, because my brother always said, I'm undertaking a spiritual crisis, and I did not acknowledge that. So I felt a sense of guilt. So this gave me another way of thinking about experience, which was very much in line with my values, and understanding it as a communication of having meaning changed everything for me.
Can you tell us from your own personal experience, what does the Hearing Voices movement means for you, or why is it special, or what does it mean to be part of it?
Yeah, I think right from the beginning we understood that this was something which was a movement which needed to be in connection with psychiatry, in connection with the general public, with society on the whole, but that we needed to be more like a kind of autonomous organisation in our own space, and this is where my skills as a community organiser came in. Was how do you create something which is not an institution and doesn't have committees and boards and a lot of emphasis on the kind of bureaucracy of an organisation. So we came up with the idea of having a very non-hierarchic, flat kind of network of networks. So we very much encouraged the idea of basically people sharing the idea of something that we call the Hearing Voices approach, which is very simple value base, nothing about the person without the person. That's a way of working with each other, that where first of all we connect as human beings, that the person with the Hearing Voices experience is the expert of their own experience. And going back to the 1980s, this was quite innovatory and even revolutionary, and it got people like Marius into difficulty, because his own psychiatric association in his own country began to wonder if he heard voices himself, what is his preoccupation, because it went against the mainstream perspective on what voices meant at that time, which is, if you hear voices, they're hallucinations, and if you have hallucinations, you need to get rid of them. You need to find a way to suppress them or to get rid of them, get them out of your life. This way of thinking about voices was completely different, which is accept the voice, engage with the voice, learn to live with the voice. A different agenda opened up in terms of the potential for people to be able to change the nature of the relationship from one that's maybe overwhelming and very, very distressing to something which is in their lives. And this has been a journey. We didn't know this from day one, but this is what we have discovered over the 30 years that the Hearing Voices movement has been in existence.
We are now here in Prague. It's 10th World Hearing Voices Conference, and you're familiar with every conference so far. Can tell us what does it mean for you personally, the conference and the meeting of people, and what is your experience from the conferences as well?
I mean, it's again in the major product, if you want to say, of the Hearing Voices movement of Intervoice is the annual conference. And I think the value of it is that for me, I go to a lot of mental health meetings, and I don't experience this kind of emotion, connection, and also even the language that's used in that room to describe experience is so different from what you will find in a psychiatric conference. Also, it's very difficult to know who's the worker and who's the person with the lived experience, because there's a sense of partnership between. And I think that's because the workers have learned that they need to acknowledge that a lot of this is about power. And we heard this morning a very strong discussion or presentation on this idea. So if we are in relationship to people who are the expert experience, it's about where we are. So it's not that we have a client relationship hierarchy where we are the experts and you learn from us. No, it's like this. We work with each other, because even those people who have got mental health professional qualifications or expertise in psychology or whatever, we're human beings too. And actually, it's, for me, very strange that in mental health services people do not acknowledge their own distress, difficulty, life history, and therefore this kind of meeting, it revitalizes, it gives you more energy to go on with the struggle, because it is a struggle. People are very skeptical about this approach. Some people are outright hostile. They don't like it. They think it's very, very threatening, and we are crazy people to think of this as experience like this. So for me, it's a bit like the gathering of a tribe. It's people coming together, can reconnect, making those connections, strengthening those connections. And another thing I really value about the Congress is they move from country to country, and each time a new country takes on the role of being the host, they organise and they decide on the thematic, and alongside the Intervoice Committee. And this means that meetings tend to reflect a lot of the culture and the agendas and the kind of things that are going on within the country that we visit. So a USA meeting is very different from a meeting in Greece, is very different from a meeting in the Netherlands. And today, for instance, we're in The Hague. This is the capital of human rights, so it makes sense that we talk about human rights. And I'm really looking forward to hearing this guy who's the special rapporteur for the United Nations on mental health and human rights, because I feel a shift in the paradigm, and that we are becoming acknowledged in terms of the way we are, the way we work with each other, and the way that we understand what emotional distress is, that people are beginning to catch up. And to hear the United Nations say, hey, you're right, is a really nice affirmation that we are onto something. But I expect, even though we've taken 30 years to get to the place, we're going to be talking about another 30 years. And at that time, in 30 years' time, I suspect people will say, voices are very old-fashioned. Why do we talk about energies? And, because again, already we need to think about how redundant we are becoming in terms of the way we're phrasing or thinking about the experience. And I'm beginning to see, I was at a meeting of radical herbalists in a yurt, kind of thing, and with people who didn't know anything about mental health in terms of hearing voices, and they rather than this kind of experience I've always usually get, which is when you talk about hearing voices, people usually, oh, you mean auditory hallucination? They're going, hearing voices, oh, you mean energies? So they were taking us further to think about that we always need to think about meaning, because people have tactile, olfactory, they have visions, and we all do. So we are holistic, whole people, and we need to be in touch much more with these kinds of ways of thinking about how we. I had a lovely quote the other day, is that every perception, every experience is partly hallucinatory. That we are always in and out of our own heads in relationship to what's going, like in this interview right now. What are you thinking, for instance, as the cameraman? It's a very interesting, and I think this is what's so attractive and interesting about the hearing voice movement. It's not just about dealing with the problems; it's also about creating a new sense of what it is to be a human being.
Yeah, thank you. And just shortly, what does it mean for you personally, the Hearing Voices approach? What is it, if you are going to explain it to someone who doesn't belong to the mental health system, inside or outside? Just what is Hearing Voices approach?
Okay, I mean, it might very strange, but in general terms, in my experience in mental health systems across the world, and there are, of course, exceptions, is that if somebody wants to talk about the Hearing Voices, people around them, particularly mental health professionals, have a tendency to be really wary and they're worried and scared, and they think that this could be very, very difficult conversation, and they're not welcoming it. And usually, and quite often, people will actually try to divert the attention of the person away from wanting to talk about their voices onto something else, which is safe. I say, hey, this is, for me, what I've learned more than anything else is how easy it is to talk to people about their voices if you just ask that first question. And if you're curious, and if you respect the idea that you need, first of all, to have some kind of trust and connection with the person who's talking about their voices, that you agree beforehand that whatever we share is personal and private to us, then you can find out from somebody very quickly what's going on for them in terms of their voices. And quite often the person who's hearing the voices has never had that conversation before. So often the case. Nobody's really asked them about, is a voice here now? No, thank heavens, but he'll be there tonight. Oh, it's a he. So you're picking up, so has he got a name? So the idea of just being curious and actually just beginning to start a very simple narrative of what the voices mean for a person. And this is what so I think, fundamentally it's finding meaning, always finding meaning. That's the key. And trusting the other person that they will be able to, if they want to, if they choose to go through this journey, and maybe as a consequence will find a way to live with their voices better, or maybe the voices will go away, or maybe you'll begin to understand what it is that you need to do to change the nature of the relationship with your voices.
The last one, very briefly, sometimes when people ask what is the intervoice, it sounds that it's some mystified, abstract thing. So how could you define the intervoice, and what does he do?
So intervoice was we used to meet informally. We didn't really have a formal international network. We were national networks, if you like. Or groups based in cities, but we didn't have a kind of unifying organisation which enabled us to communicate with each other. And especially from the mid-90s, with the development of good internet connections and the whole development of social media, it became much more easy for us to connect with each other internationally. And it made sense that we began to maybe have some kind of overarching organisation which kind of, like, if you like, respected and understood what the value base of the organisation and also what the Hearing Voices approach. So it's kind of like it's a way of creating a protection around the space, so we don't end up being turned into something medical, or we were very aware that people tried to co-opt this approach and turn it into a medical approach. So we wanted to make sure that we maintain that the Hearing Voices approach is not just the Hearing Voices dialoguing or the Maastricht interview schedule. It's not tools and techniques. It's actually fundamentally a movement which is seeking to change society's perceptions of the meaning of voices. So in that way, I always say the best way to think about it is the analogy with the human rights movement about emancipating the experience of gay community. It used to be a disorder within the DSM, and it wasn't the fact that psychiatrists woke up one morning and thought, oh, there's no evidence for this, we have to throw it out. It was the fact that society had changed its mind about being gay, and that didn't happen just by itself, because gay people organised, they radicalised, and they became a movement, and they stood up for their rights, and they changed the perspective and the conversation and the narrative around gender, sexuality. And now we don't think so much in terms of binary anymore. We think plurality. We think where people are in all sorts of different places and spaces during time and space. And that's also true for Hearing Voices. So I think our main aim isn't to change psychiatry by engaging with psychiatry, it's changing society's perceptions of voices, and that will change psychiatry. So we always need to keep that in mind, and that's why we have Intervoice.